Well, thank you all for coming out on this beautiful day. Yeah, we certainly wait for days like this. But anyway, the first question I always get about this book is, why did you write it? And, when I finished my last book, I didn't really have a project in mind. But in 2023, when Miguel Cabrera retired, one of the writers in Detroit said, well, there goes the greatest hitter in Tiger history. And I went, he's a great hitter, granted, a marvelous hitter, but not the greatest in history. But I didn't really know where to think of him. Was he third? Was he fifth? Was he ninth? And I set about to develop a formula that would tell me. And it was 14 performance metrics, many of them traditional statistics, some of them the new, like WAR and defensive WAR. And I put in OPS, and I put in runs and hits and home runs and RBIs and stuff like that. And then I dismissed for each hitter the two lowest, where he ranked the lowest. So it was really a ranking based on 12 metrics. And I did that for Cabrera. I did that for everybody that I thought might be ranked around him. And he ended up seventh. And I thought, that's a good spot for him. The guy I thought would finish first did finish first, Ty Cobb. The guy I thought would finish second did finish second, Al Kaline. And then I wasn't quite sure where all the slots would be filled. I had an inkling that Gehringer might finish third. He didn't finish third, Charlie Gehringer, the great second baseman. And after that, it was just kind of a jump ball. I didn't know where Whitaker would finish. I didn't know where Tram would finish. I didn't know where Harry Heilman would finish. And I had first, second, third, and seventh. Whitaker finished fourth. And it was a formula that kind of rewarded longevity, and Lou certainly had that. But he also had the excellence of his career. And I want to say right up front, there was nothing subjective about this ranking. I mean, I covered the Tigers for a long time, so I had my favorites, I had my opinions on who should finish where. But this was all done based on the statistics, based on the numbers. I didn't put any of my opinions into it. I didn't factor in whether they played for good teams or bad. It was all their numbers. So Whitaker finished fourth. And then once you get to Whitaker, you automatically think, well, where does that mean Trammell would finish? They were side by side for their entire career. Trammell finished fifth. And I thought, well, that's fitting, and I was really glad to see that. Tram especially graded high on defense. And number 6 was the great outfielder Harry Heilman. And then came Cabrera. And then came Hall of Fame outfielder Sam Crawford. And then Hank Greenberg. And to a lot of people, that's too low for Greenberg. But I remind people that Greenberg lost 4 years to World War II. And that took a chunk of productivity out of his career. And it cost him a few slots. And he's still the greatest. Well, if you look at his slugging numbers, he's the greatest slugger in Tiger history. Number 10 was Norm Cash. And that's great because growing up, he was my favorite player. And I was glad that he finished that high, but I really didn't have any say in it. Again, it was all numbers. Then I turned to, after Cabrera, I just kept going. And I eventually got to 258 hitters. And so I stopped at 258 because I had a fitting last place guy. And that was Ray Euler of the 1968 Tigers, who couldn't hit a lick, he went 0 for July, I believe, that year. And of course, Ray was a defensive player, and he was a really good shortstop. But he was the reason Mayo Smith that year moved Mickey Stanley from center to short, and moved Jim Northrup from right to left, and so they could get Al Kaline into the World Series lineup. And it worked. You know, Kaline had a fine World Series. Stanley played his position well, and of course the Tigers beat the Cardinals. So then I had to think about, well, what do I do about pitchers? I can't use the same metrics for pitchers that I use for hitters. Well, I came up with a formula of 8 metrics, 6 positive ones minus 2 negative ones, like losses and earned runs allowed. And it was really based on just the raw stats, and Mickey Lolich easily finished first. And because Mickey Lolich really, Alex has heard me say this a million times, he represents an era of pitching we'll never see again. You know, back in the early 70s, he averaged 330 innings for 4 years. You know, these days it would take a pitcher 2 years just to get to 330 innings. I mean, that's just the way baseball is now. You get to the 6th inning and you're a candidate to be taken out of the game. But number 2, I'll let Alex take over from here, because he was very close and still is very close to the number 2 guy.
Well, when Tom asked me about doing this book and finally sent me the list and kind of going through it, I figured Justin would be up there. But I wasn't quite sure if he was as good as Mickey Lolich, and obviously that wasn't the case. Justin ended up at number 2. But when I had told Justin that I was joining Tom on doing this book and in this endeavor of ranking the top Tigers players, he first of all, he tells me, he's like, well, don't tell me yet where I'm at. But when the book finally came out this spring, we were doing a signing in Lakeland. So I called him up and said, hey, we're going to be in Lakeland. We're going to do a book signing before one of the games. I'd like to bring you one of the books. It's finally out. He says, perfect, great, sounds good. Just, come by the house. So I come to his house and walk through the door. First thing he tells me, he goes, all right, fine, hit me. Where am I at? Where am I on the list? And I was like, well, you're not number 1. And, he wasn't totally upset about that, but in his way, he kind of was. But he knows Tigers history pretty well, so he's like, well, let me guess, it's Mickey Lolich. I'm like, yeah, it's Mickey Lolich. So I told him, I'll sign the book for you. And so I signed it, sorry you're not number 1. And he got a kick out of that. But like Tom was saying, I think Mickey, represented an era of pitching, not just Tigers pitching, but pitching in general that we'll never see again. And fittingly, Justin being number 2, when he retires at the end of the season, he'll represent an era of pitching that we'll never see again as well, because in his prime, he was averaging 200 to 250 innings a year here in Detroit. And, you don't if a pitcher gets to 180 innings this year, that'll be a surprise. I think, the guy, a couple of guys that are leading in innings pitched, they may get to 165, 175. And that's just the nature, how the game has evolved. So I think it's fitting that both of those guys finished 1 and 2, kind of representing an era of baseball that we won't see again.
Yeah, you watch a Tiger game today, and if a starting pitcher gets through the 6th inning, and if he's up to about 85 pitches, AJ begins to itch, and he gets nervous. But it's not, as much as I am critical of A.J. Hinch for taking a pitcher out too early, it's across the board. Every manager is like that. I look at the box scores, and it's very rare to have a pitcher get to 100 pitches or even beyond 95. And so that's just the way baseball is played now. The bullpens are a huge part of the game. Not just the closer, but the middle bullpen. You need a guy for the 7th inning. You need a guy for the 8th inning. Sometimes you need a guy for each of those 2 innings, and you use 3 pitchers after the 6th inning. It's not the game I watched growing up or even covered, and I don't even think it's the game that Alex saw in the majors. But the bullpen is a huge part of the game now, and starters aren't de-emphasized because they better be good for 6 innings, but they just don't get build the same number of innings pitched that Mickey Lolich or Denny McLain or Frank Larry or Jim Bunning did. So as far as pitchers are concerned, though, yes, Lolich was number 1, Verlander's number 2, number 3. Then we call it the pitching Mount Rushmore of the Tigers. Hal Newhouser is number 3. He had a great career in the 40s during the war years, but also after the war years. He won 20 games. He was he was a pitcher who had trouble at the beginning of his career, but once he found it, he really found it. Number 4 on Mount Rushmore is Jack Morris, because he almost represents his own era. From 1984, he pitched many more innings than you'll see anybody pitch today. So those are the 4 on Mount Rushmore. You have Lolich, Verlander, Newhouser, and Morris. After that, you get into some pitchers you have not heard of. George Mullen from the early 1900s, Hooks Doss from the teens and the 20s, but you also have Jim Bunning, you have Virgil Trout, you have Virgil Trucks, you have Dizzy Trout, and the Tigers have really been blessed with a lot of fine pitchers. So once we got that established, we go straight to what were the no-brainers of doing this list. And we take this position by position. First of all, we go to the catchers. I'm fortunate to be sitting next to the hitter who, of 258 hitters, Alex ranks number 75. And I think that's really a great ranking. He's also, in Tiger history, the number 6 catcher. And I think that's really a great credit to his career. The number 1 and 2 catchers were Bill Freehan, who certainly knew this town well, and also followed by Lance Parrish. They were easily 1 and 2. Freehan, like Whitaker, is a candidate for the Hall of Fame. Lance left as a free agent in 1986, wishes he hadn't, and is to this day, of course, is a Tiger through and through. He lives in the Detroit area, and he really loves the Tigers, as does his entire family. There were other great catchers in Tiger history. Pudge, of course, had some good seasons for the Tigers, just not enough to really challenge the top 2. Mickey Tettleton had a lot of power, and they were in the top 6 as well. When you get to first base, the Tigers have been blessed with many great first basemen. Not just Cabrera, not just Cash, not just Greenberg. You have Rudy York in the 40s, and you have after that, let me check my list. You have Cabrera, Greenberg, Cash, York, and of course Cecil. Cecil with his 50 home runs in the early 90s in consecutive seasons. Cecil Fielder belongs on that list. At second base, it came down to 2 guys, Whitaker and Greenberg. I thought they would be close. Gehringer, I'm sorry. Whitaker and Gehringer. I thought they would be close. They were, and not separated by much, but Gehringer finished ahead of Whitaker, and in not too distant a third, but enough to really be a third place finisher was Dick McAuliffe from the 60s, who we remembered as part of the 1968 Tigers. At short, the easy winner was Alan Trammell as I don't call them the best. We didn't discover the best players in Tiger history because that sounds subjective. I call them the most statistically significant players. And so Trammell was that at short, followed by quite some distance by Billy Rogel at short. And then we get to third base, which is, to me, is one of the most fascinating positions in Tiger history, because the Tiger, of any position on the diamond, the Tigers have had fewer great or really good third basemen than at any other position. And I'll turn it over to Alex because it's at third base where the biggest surprise of the book, his biggest surprise of the book, occurred.
Well, when Tom, once the list was all put together, and Tom had sent it over to me and says, the first exercise we want to, try to do is take a look at the list, see where everything's at, but then come back with me with, your biggest surprise, like, going through the position players, the pitchers, what surprises you the most from, looking at this list? And for me, instantly jumping off the page was third base, because I thought everyone, as far as like the top 10 and all the other positions, were fairly where I thought they would be. The pitchers, there were, a couple of surprises here and there, but third base was really jumping out at me. And like Tom was saying, there wasn't like a just clear-cut great third baseman in Tigers history. And the number one third baseman in Tigers history came out to be Travis Fryman. And that's when I saw that, I'm like, man, I saw Travis Fryman play a lot. I never thought for 1 second that he's the greatest Tigers third baseman in history since 1901. And so then we kind of started really diving into some of the stories, the numbers, looking at the teams during those 90s Tigers teams. And then you start to uncover how good of a baseball player he was. And the problem is those teams weren't very good in those mid-90s. So there wasn't a lot of national acclaim. There wasn't a lot of local acclaim really either with the seasons he was putting up. He played for the Tigers for 7 years, seven and a half years, or 7 full seasons. 4 of those years he was an all-star. He had 80-plus RBIs for all 7 of those years, 20-plus or more homers in 5 of those 7 years. And I always knew he was a good player because I remember watching him with the Tigers, watching him with the Indians after. And, but when you actually really look at his numbers, especially the RBIs, because he may not have had as much power as you would have liked out of your third baseman, but when it came to being an RBI man, an actual run producer, he was as opportunistic as you can get. Because one, he's playing on bad teams, so you have less opportunities than you would on good teams. So each opportunity he had throughout the year, he made the most of it. So he's a very clutch player when the time came with guys on base. And so for me, even though it was a big surprise, once I started kind of looking at it, I was like, man, he really was the best third baseman in Tigers history. Number 2 was a bit of a surprise, but not as much to me, was Brandon Inge. He was the second best third baseman in Tigers history. Now, I played with Brandon for a long time, and once he became a third baseman, because he came up a catcher, even played a little bit of center field as well, but once he became a third baseman, he started to find the offense a little bit. He at least had some power. He didn't have as much in the average department, but in the bottom of the lineup, he's hitting you 15 to 20 home runs, driving in 60 RBIs. You'll take that all day long with some Gold Glove defense. And he certainly was an excellent defender. He was every year at third base with the Tigers. He was a plus defender in all the defensive metrics. And I think they probably didn't even look at him, as well as they should have, because he had tremendous range. He'd got to a lot more balls than most third basemen did. And I always tell people he was the greatest athlete that I've ever played with, and that's including all the other teams that I played for. I mean, people don't believe me, but I tell them, it's like, he can drive a golf ball 350 yards. He can, he can dunk a basketball. He can skate on the rink with a mean slap shot. Like, he was a tremendous athlete, and still is. But those two, that was third base was my biggest surprise, because I think sometimes you could lose sight of how good some of the players were depending on the teams they were on. And I think that's one thing about this book too, not just, the top players, but as you kind of go through even like the players that are in the teens or in the 20s, you remember, oh man, that he was a pretty good player. You just tend to forget sometimes, and that was the case for Fryman for me.
Well, I know where you're coming from, Alex, because going into doing the stats at third, I would have said, if somebody had asked me who's going to finish first among third basemen, I would have said quickly George Kell. And George Kell is a Hall of Famer. And the reason George didn't finish first is because he played more for other teams than he did for the Tigers. He got traded too early in his career to, I think, to the Red Sox, and he ended up playing more games and had more at-bats for other teams than he did for Detroit. I got to know George later on as a broadcaster. I valued him as a friend, and if I had put him as number one at third base, it would have been subjective. This was a voyage of discovery for me as well, because I had to go with who the numbers told me were the top players. And again, somebody might say, well, wait a minute, you can't use you can't use Fryman at third because he played 3 years at short. Well, that's true, and Brandon Inge played a couple of years behind the plate. But I had to assign them, and I chose to assign them one position, and it was the position where they played the most games. So that's why Fryman is a third baseman, and that's why Inge is a third baseman. And as it was, I think they played more games at third than Kell did. So it was a real surprise to me that Kell finished third. And, it was such a surprise that I had to double and triple check the stats. But my biggest surprise, Alex referred to players that didn't play for very good teams. My biggest surprise was an outfielder. The Tigers have had great outfielders. We already talked about Cobb and Kaline and Heilman and Crawford. They had Bobby Veach in the 20s, who was a Cobb teammate. They had Kirk Gibson, Willie Horton, Chet Lemon, Jim Northrup, Mickey Stanley. It really goes on. And rarely do Tiger fans think of this, the outfielder I'm going to mention, as being a really productive Tiger. But he was. In fact, he finished ahead of both Gibson and Horton. And this wasn't the stat I just checked twice. I think I checked it 4 times. And that was Bobby Higginson. Bobby Higginson had 11 productive seasons for the Tigers. However, they were lousy during his career. And most of you remember that era. He played for bad teams, never played in the postseason, never got any national attention, never got, again, they just, nothing to bring any kind of acclaim his way. But Higginson, when I did the stats, finished 17th or higher on 9 of the stats. And, I mentioned that I threw out 2 metrics for each player. Higginson had 2 that were worthy of tossing. Gibson had 2 that were worthy of tossing. Willie Horton needed 3. That means he was saddled with 1 metric that really dragged him down, and that's why he finishes behind Higginson and Gibson. And as for the others, they are all top 25 players on the list, Lemon, Stanley, and Northrup, but they're a little bit farther down. So my biggest surprise was Bobby Higginson, not a very popular Tiger. Even now, he wasn't a very friendly guy, and it certainly wasn't an era in which Tiger fans had much to cheer about. So if you're surprised by this selection, I was too. So when we get to pitchers, we've already discussed the pitchers. We get to relief pitchers, and there's a clear winner among the relief pitchers. You know, this has been a position that has really developed quite late in the history of baseball. You know, especially the closer position. But the number one relief pitcher in Tiger history, or the one who was most statistically significant, was John Hiller. And I think most of us know Hiller's story. He was a so-so starter. In fact, he would probably raise his hand and say, I was worse than that. You know, he didn't, then he had a heart attack in the early 70s. And that really, and John fought hard to come back from the heart attack. And he did. But he found his changeup along the way, a new pitch for him. And that's really what made him the relief pitcher that he turned into. And so, again, John Hiller is the number one relief pitcher on the list. There are certainly other quality relief pitchers on the list. Mike Henneman, Todd Jones, Aurelio Lopez, Willie Hernandez, although we'll talk about Willie later because he didn't finish as high as I thought he might. Another pitcher who finished quite high on the relief pitcher list was Hank Aguirre. And, you know, a lot of people will say, well, wait a minute. Aguirre was a starting pitcher. Yes. And in fact, the number of his appearances in his career were almost 50-50. But when you really look at it, the number of the appearances he made in his career, he made more appearances as a relief pitcher than as a starter. So I assigned him relief pitching. And so even though he was quite good at both, in fact, he was probably better as a starter because he won the league's ERA crown one year. He made it onto the list as a relief pitcher. So from the no-brainers, we go to the surprises, and we go back to catching. And that takes us to Mickey Cochrane. Because a lot of people say, well, wait a minute. No, you haven't mentioned Mickey Cochrane yet. And that's intentional because Mickey is a true Tiger legend. He was. He played, but he spent most of his career, almost, I would say probably 75% of it, playing for the Philadelphia A's. He came to the Tigers in 1934. He played only 2 full seasons for the Tigers before he got hurt, there were other physical setbacks, and so he played 2 full seasons and 2 partial seasons. What made him a hero is that he managed, as well as being the catcher, on the 35 season, which was the first year the Tigers ever won the World Series. They had been to the World Series in 7, 8, and 9. Then they reached a stage of quite a lengthy time of just either being bad or mediocre at best, and then they bounced back in the 30s. And it was Cochrane who not only managed the 35 Tigers, excelled as their catcher, but also scored the winning run in Game 6 of the World Series when he came home from second base on a Goose Goslin single to right in Game 6. So that's why Detroit and Tiger fans remember Mickey Cochrane as a hero, because he was one. He just didn't qualify according to the metrics as deserving a high place because he just didn't have the longevity. From that point on, after Mickey Cochrane, hold on, we go to, we have already talked about George Kell, we've talked about Higginson, and why Willie Horton finished behind him. The next player we talk about is a starting pitcher, and that's Denny McLain. And Denny McLain is not on Mount Rushmore. He probably would try to sell it. But Denny, I like Denny a lot. I do. Every time his name comes up and I talk to people about him, I say he's a true charmer and with great personality, but he just wasn't very trustworthy.
What is it that you say that you wouldn't trust him to walk your dog?
No, I would not. I wouldn't trust him for coming back with it. But Denny, of course, had one absolutely superb season, 1968, when he won 31 games. Nobody's ever going to win 31 games again. I would be surprised if anybody wins in the mid-20s. You know, they just there are good pitchers out there, but they just don't stay in long enough to get that number of decisions. But after what he did in '68 with the 31 wins, he had another good season after that, and then his career kind of went off the rails. The Tigers traded him to Washington, and he disappeared. So even though Denny McLain had two good enough seasons to make him 14th on the pitching list, he really doesn't deserve to be any higher than that. Now we talk about relief pitching and Willie Hernandez. Willie, according to some, should be remembered as the, if not the best relief pitcher in Tiger history, then second best. He finished seventh. And the reason that he finished seventh is because after Willie won everything there was to win in 1984, MVP, Cy Young, with that great season he had another good season for the Tigers, but then his career went off the rails, and he began going downhill until finally disappearing, and from the Tiger roster. And in the end, he didn't deserve to be any higher than seventh. You know, I covered Willie's career. He was an automatic. Oh boy, I tell you that. In '84, they loved seeing him come in from the bullpen, and rightly so. He got it done, but he didn't get it done for enough years. So that's basically, the thing about doing this project with Alex, though, is we've had such great discussions about many of the Tigers' starting pitchers. You know, he caught both Max Scherzer and Justin Verlander. But one time when I asked him who had the best stuff of the pitchers you caught on the Tigers, I thought he would say one of those two guys, and he didn't.
No, and I mean that's one of the great things I think for me when Tom had asked me to do this book with him and go on this little venture was the conversations that we would have about each player, because it's easy for everyone to kind of look up the stats for your favorite players and know what their ERA was, how many strikeouts, how many home runs that they hit. But it's the stories that we were able to kind of compile and put together for this book, whether by research or just by our own experiences. And when Tom had asked me that question when we were, discussing those guys, I said it was neither one of them. And he was like, really? Who was it? It's like, well, the guy that had the best stuff during those years, at least in my eyes, was Anibal Sanchez. And I thought, I wouldn't say by far, but when it come to a total arsenal, Anibal had a mid-upper 90s fastball like Max and like Justin, but his off-speed and secondary pitches were one, sometimes he made them up as the game went along, but he also had several that he could use to get hitters out. Justin and Max, at least during those times, were very specific on how they got certain hitters out. They had a certain game plan that, was designed for left-handed hitters, certain game plan designed for right-handed hitters. And for the most part, we followed those because they executed really well. Sometimes we'd have to make adjustments as the game went on. But with Anibal, you can be completely unpredictable. You can get a lefty or a righty out with any one of his pitches. So that made it a lot of fun for myself behind the plate to kind of, I can go through, a lineup 3 or 4 times and be able to get the same hitter out 3 or 4 different ways. And Anibal, like I said, sometimes he'd make up pitches. He had one of his best pitches was a split-fingered changeup that he threw. Sometimes some people called it like the Vulcan because he would hold it with his right in between his middle finger and his ring finger like that. The ball would split his fingers, and he'd throw it really hard and it'd act like a split-fingered fastball. be 89 miles an hour. And then one day I call it, and he throws it, but it comes in at like 62 miles an hour, a lot slower. And I'm like, what was that? He goes, I felt like throwing it slower in that time. And he got the reaction from the hitter that he wanted to, so we added it to the arsenal. So that was just another pitch that we were gonna call. Now, sometimes I didn't always know when he would throw it, but I was familiar enough with him that I would still catch it. But that was something that was a surprise to Tom. But that was I've always kind of maintained that about Anibal. He made the list, of one of the best pitchers in Tigers history as well, with some of his good years. He won an ERA title one year as a Tiger. Also had a 18 strikeout game as a Tiger. Another one of my favorite pitchers, from those years was Doug Fister. And when we got Doug in a trade in 2011. He really had some, great stretches with us. But I'll never forget, and a lot of people get a kick out of this story, because Doug is a very easygoing guy. Just a superhuman. He was almost like, he's such a nice person that it kind of made you suspicious a little bit. Like, are you really this nice of a guy? But he was great. But his first start as a Tiger, I'll never forget. He was in full uniform, his spikes were on, and he's laying on the couch in the clubhouse asleep about 30 minutes before the game. And he never wanted to go over, game plans or anything like that. He just left that up to the catcher, and he's like, I'm going to throw whatever you call. I said, okay, that's fine. But I'm getting ready to go out for the game. Game starts in about 30 minutes, and he is dead asleep on the couch. So I go over and I, shake him, wake him up, and I'm like, Doug, you're pitching today, right? This is his first start as a Tiger. We had just gotten him in a trade. Nobody knows him from Adam. And he looks up at me. He goes, what time is it? I was like, it's about 6:30. The game's at 7:05. He goes, all right, I'll be out there in about 10 minutes. And goes right back to sleep. And sure enough, like, I'm outside, warming up, and he comes walking out, does his warm-up, and I think he ended up throwing 7 innings in that game. So he was one of my favorites. When he was on, he probably had some of the best command on those staffs, because when he was really in a groove, like I would always say, like, sometimes I could probably catch him with my eyes closed. That's how good a command he had at times.
We've already mentioned Max Scherzer a time or two. I had great respect for Max because I thought he was so intelligent. And I always admired that Alex was able to go out to the mound and converse with both Verlander and Scherzer, because I thought they were really both great pitchers and both very highly intelligent pitchers. But with Scherzer, it wasn't always about baseball that Alex would talk. So talk about one time when you went out to the mound to talk to Max and really had nothing to talk to him about.
Yeah, so when we got to Max on the book here, and obviously Tom had covered Max as well. He's like, tell me a little bit something about Max that I don't know. And I was like, well, I mean, most people know, Max, especially Tom, covering him. But I was like, I'll tell you a little story about Max that, maybe people don't know. And that was, he loved playing fantasy football. Big fantasy football player. So like every year we would put a league together amongst the guys on the team, and towards the end of one season, it was middle September, and we're playing a game in Kansas City, and we had about in the third inning, 2 guys on with nobody out. He's kind of laboring through this inning. Now the NFL season had already started. We had already done our draft. We had already a couple of NFL Sundays in the books. And I had been mulling over possibly proposing a trade to Max, a fantasy football trade, and wanting a player from his team and seeing if he wanted to one of the guys that I was offering. Now, I wanted to give him a break in this inning though, because he had a couple of guys on, was kind of laboring through this inning, but there was nothing I was going to tell him from a mechanic standpoint that he didn't already know. We knew the game plan really well as far as what we wanted to do to the next opposing hitters. But I didn't want to just go out there and not say anything and just say, hey, I'm just trying to give you a breather here. I'm like, let me see if I can catch him off guard and offer him a trade here on the mound. And so I call timeout, run out to the mound, and he's got his glove over his mouth, and he goes, what do you got for me? I says, well, I have so-and-so who's on the bench. I'll trade you him if you give me this guy. And he's looking at me. It took him a minute to like kind of understand where I was coming from. And then he realized, oh, he's talking about fantasy football. And he starts actually thinking about it. He's like, well, hold on a second. Well, what about this guy? Why don't we trade these two guys? And he comes back at me with another trade proposal. And so we start going back and forth, throwing trade proposals at each other. Meanwhile, there's two guys on base. We're in the middle of the third inning, and in a game in September in Kansas City. And it seemed like we were out there for 15 minutes. It was probably more like, a minute or two. But definitely much longer than any normal mound visit. And the home plate umpire comes running out there, and he's like, come on, guys, what are you doing? Let's get this game moving. I'm like, hold on a second. We almost have a fantasy football trade in the works here. We almost confirmed it. And he's like, no, let's go. Let's get this game moving. And so I ran back behind the plate, and he ended up, getting out of that inning and pitching pretty well the rest of that game. But I would not be able to do that with Justin. Justin, I would have had to make sure that I had something for him more concrete that, was specific to the game. But each pitcher had their own, different personalities, different quirks, and, different ways of preparing. And, most of my job was kind of deciphering and kind of, bobbing and weaving through all the different personalities, knowing them well enough to know what I needed to do, say, and on how to motivate, how to help them get through tough situations, and get the best out of them in each and every day. And for Max, I was, at times I was able to, use things outside of baseball to help him refocus. Sometimes those mound visits are just a matter of maybe getting your mind off of a tough situation, because every mound visit is because something is not going very well. And so a lot of times it's trying to refocus them, because they already have a pretty good idea what they're doing physically and what we want to do from the game plan standpoint. Unless there's something, kind of egregious, then, usually it's trying to refocus those guys. And, for Max that particular day, we didn't end up actually, getting a trade agreed on, because he, as you can imagine, Max was, not easy to try to win a fantasy football trade on. He always felt like he needed to be the winner of each trade. But that was a fun one that Tom didn't know, and I'm pretty sure that made its way in the book.
Yeah. Well, one day in 2010, I as the beat writer for the news, I didn't get a whole lot of time off. Maybe one game per homestand, especially if the Tigers had more than one series. But this night I had the night off. And we were coming back from the airport because my son was flying in from Washington, D.C. And I was just enjoying the day off when I decided to turn on the car radio, to see what the Tigers were doing. And Armando Galarraga hadn't allowed a hit. And, so I kept the radio on, and one thing led to another, and what happened with 2 outs in the ninth. He had a perfect game on the line. And I'm not at the ballpark covering it. I had covered Milt Wilcox's flirtation with a perfect game in 1983. But, the Tigers have never thrown a perfect game, ever. They've thrown no-hitters, of course, and I've covered those. But, here I am in the car heading back from the airport, and I'm thinking, I'm going to miss this moment in Tiger history. And so Alex was catching that game. What happened with 2 outs in the ninth?
Gee, I don't know. But I mean, that story always comes up. That's always a question I get asked, really anywhere I go, even while I was playing, still towards, because that was at the beginning of my career. So even during the rest of my career, people would ask me about that game and like what I was thinking, what were my emotions like after the fact. Do you think they should change it? To the point where ESPN did a whole documentary on the game itself and did a series of interviews with a bunch of us that had played in that game. And, I tell people all the time, I was backing up first base on that play. So from my angle, I couldn't quite tell whether Armando Galarraga was actually on the base and or actually, whether he was actually out or safe from my angle. So when Jim Joyce had called him safe, my assumption was, oh, maybe Armando missed the bag. And but usually the umpire will give a signal that the pitcher was off the bag in that instance, and he didn't. And then I saw Miggy's reaction, and then realized, oh man, he missed the call. But the way my mind always works during a game behind the plate was like, I'm always going to the next pitch. And as devastated I was for that split second, we still had a game to win. We were up 3-0 at the time. At that point in the year, we're still trying to kind of get our footing as a team. And every game is a must-win game. At least that's the way we always look at it. And so that was my initial reaction. And then obviously then after the fact, just kind of seeing how everything unfolded. And when people ask me, do you think MLB should change it? I've always maintained that they shouldn't. Mainly because I think it's more famous now because it wasn't a perfect game than if it would have been a perfect game. And that's the question I always ask people that ask me that question is, well, what perfect games do you remember? And it's always Don Larson in the World Series because, that's a pretty big one, probably the most famous perfect game ever. And then it's this one, not even any of the other 27 perfect games or 26 perfect games that have been thrown in baseball history, because of the story and what happened after the fact. The story, the humility that came out of it. Jim Joyce's reaction, Armando's reaction. It's probably the only perfect game, or what would have been a perfect game, that gets talked about and celebrated on social media and through all the media on the anniversary every year. And, so I've always maintained that. I've always thought what set up that next day when Jim Joyce came out to home plate as well, with Armando going to home plate for the lineup card exchange, that was the idea of Gene Lamont, our third base coach at the time, and Jim Leland, because Jim was very understanding of the situation and wanted to make sure that, us as players, understood that, hey, the fans are going to follow our reaction. And, he felt bad for Jim Joyce. So he knew once he was going to come out of that umpire's tunnel, there was going to be raining boos on him. So he had asked Armando, hey, why don't you go take the lineup card out when the umpires come out? So that way, when they see you coming out of the dugout, those boos all turn to cheers. And that's exactly what happened. The whole place, kind of went nuts, and there was a standing ovation. And then I think the entire mood switched on a dime. It was a crazy 48 hours, I tell you what.
I want to read to you before we go too much further the dream teams on the Tigers as our stats discovered. The number one dream team of the Tigers: Lolich at pitcher, Freehan at catcher, Cabrera at first, Gehringer at second, Trammell at short, Fryman at third, an outfield of Heilman, Cobb, and Kaline, with Greenberg as the DH. Number two, the second team: Verlander on the mound, Parrish catching, Cash at first, Whitaker at second, Rogel at short, Inge at third, Bobby Veach, Sam Crawford, and Bobby Higginson in the outfield, Rudy York as the DH. And the honorable mentions go to Newhouser, Morris, George Mullen, a pitcher from the early 1900s, Cecil Fielder, Dick McAuliffe, Kirk Gibson, Willie Horton, Jim Northrup, Mickey Stanley, and Chet Lemon. This was a great journey of discovery for me as well. I loved covering the Tigers on a daily basis, but I found I love Tiger history even more. And for a franchise that goes back to 1901 as an American League team, there's a lot of history. And much of it I didn't know. it turned out that I found the most fascinating Tiger player was Harry Heilman because he was the focal point of more than one great story in Tiger history. You know, when Harry grew up in San Francisco, he wasn't even the best player in his own family. His older brother, Walter, was a more highly rated pitcher than Harry was an outfielder or a hitter. One day Walter also, as I said, they grew up in San Francisco, and one day Walter took the sailboat, this family sailboat out onto San Francisco Bay. It was a windy day. The water was choppy. He capsized and didn't make it back to shore. It was a terrible tragedy for the Heilman family, but Harry used it to really spur him on to become a better player. So now we're talking about maybe 8 years later. He's a Detroit Tiger, and they've just played a afternoon game on a hot July afternoon at Bennett Park or Navin Field, whatever it was called, in 1916. And he gets into his car and drives out along the Detroit River where people are cooling off in the water. And he parks the truck and near a car that makes a huge mistake. The driver makes a huge mistake. Instead of putting the car into drive, he puts it into reverse. He's got several passengers in the car, and in reverse, it plunges into the river right in front of Harry Heilman. Harry gets out of the car and shrugs off the memory of how his brother died and jumps into the water and saves two people, saves their lives. Two people did die in that incident, but he rescued the driver's wife, and he rescued the driver's little daughter. And it was a great act of heroism for Harry Heilman. He didn't wait around to get any credit, though, or any acclaim. He got back into his car and drove away. Somebody, though, had noticed who it was. And even though it wasn't an era of TV or ESPN or even baseball cards, they knew it was Harry Heilman of the Detroit Tigers. And the next day before the game, when his name was announced for the first time, he got a standing ovation. He was an instant Detroit hero. And I found that to be a fascinating story. About 5 years after that, Harry had established himself as a great, great hitter on the Tigers. You know, he hit 400 one year, and he was really a wonderful, wonderful hitter. But he would always hit behind Bobby Veach in the batting order. Now, Veach was a good hitter, too. He hit a career 300-plus hitter, and he was a really quality hitter. But it was the first year that Ty Cobb managed the team. And if you know anything about Ty Cobb, you know what his personality was like. He was snarly, irascible, disagreeable, everything that Bobby Veach wasn't. Bobby Veach had a smile on his face. He greeted everybody. He was friendly, and it drove Cobb crazy. It really did. And so one day, Cobb went up to Harry Heilman, again, who would always be in the on-deck circle when Veach was hitting. And he said, I want you to start, I don't think he brings enough intensity to what he does. I want to turn him into a better hitter. And so to do that, I want you to yell insults at him when he's up at hitting. And Harry said, I don't want to do that. He's one of my good friends. He said, oh, never mind. He said, I'll tell him at the end of the year that it was my idea. And that convinced Heilman to do it. And so Veach would go up to the plate, and he would say something to the catcher and chat with the umpire, all the while Cobb, really kind of fumed quietly on the side. But Heilman would say, hey, you're lousy, you can't hit the next pitch, and everything that one good friend wouldn't yell to another. But it worked. Veach had a really fine season, I believe, in 1921, but it cost them their friendship because, for the entire season, Harry Heilman, one of his good friends, was yelling at him. And the problem was that Cobb had promised Heilman that he would tell Veach at the end that it was his idea. And if there was any blame to go around, blame him. Cobb didn't do it. Yeah, Cobb went back on his promise. And so it did cost them their friendship. And I found that to be really too bad, but pretty much what I thought a Ty Cobb story would be. The Ty Cobb story that I didn't think would be was that years later, Harry Heilman went on to be a great Tiger player and a broadcaster, one of their first broadcasters. But he was a chain smoker, and in 1951, I believe it was, he was dying of lung cancer. He was in the hospital on his deathbed, and his old manager and his old colleague Ty Cobb went up to visit him. I think Heilman probably was rather surprised. They hadn't been good friends, but Cobb wanted to pay his respects to Heilman in his dwindling hours. But what Cobb did was very nice. He said, Harry, I want to tell you something. You've made it to the Hall of Fame. And Harry Heilman died thinking he was a Hall of Famer when he wasn't. Cobb made it up. But he did it so that he knew how much it would mean to Heilman to pass away thinking he was a Hall of Famer. But Cobb then did something even nicer than that. He made a ton of phone calls to make sure that at the next election, the Hall of Fame election, that Heilman was elected so that he was inducted the following year. I mean, obviously Harry wasn't there to give a speech, but at least he had died with somewhat of a smile on his face. And I thought that was a great story for Ty Cobb, because any Tiger fan has heard this Cobb stories. I told you one. You know, he could be mean, he could be vindictive, he could be nasty. But the other side of Cobb is that, you know, there were parts of him that were a good person. You know, in retirement, he also financed a medical facility down in Georgia. He wasn't all bad. And there have been many books written about Ty Cobb, and I think they all reached the same conclusion, that even though there was a lot that was disagreeable and really not to like about him, there were things to like about him. So the other Tiger that I thought was, that I had never known about, that I found a funny story about, was a guy by the name of Bob Fothergill. And Bob Fothergill was an outfielder in the 1930s, again, like Bobby Veach, a very, very good hitter. But unlike anybody else, I think, that ever played for the Tigers, he was, let's just say, roly-poly. You know, he was short and he weighed 280. And, you know, he wasn't a terrible outfielder. He was a great hitter who chose baseball over football because he thought he would eat better as a major leaguer than he would as a football player. But so one day the Tigers were playing the Yankees, and you know, here's Bob Fothergill with his larger than average girth, okay, and he steps into the batter's box, and you know, he's a big guy. He's got a big stomach, and Leo DeRocher was playing shortstop for the Yankees, and he calls timeout and makes a big show of it, waves his arms and gets the umpire's attention, and says, "Hey, this something's wrong here. You can't have two hitters in the batter's box at the same time." And of course, it was an obvious reference to Fothergill's size, and it really infuriated Fothergill. And you know, Bob Fothergill rarely struck out. He was a contact hitter. He struck. There were many seasons in which he struck out about 20 times a year, and he was a good hitter. He took a call through strike in this at bat, though, because he was so mad at DeRocher that he couldn't think straight. So, it was rare for him to strike out. It was rarer still to take a call third strike. Well, it was the third out of the inning, and instead of going back to the dugout, he chased DeRocher off the field. And so to me, that just shows you really how colorful I think baseball was in that era. Somebody who in this era who was very colorful, unfortunately, isn't a player and couldn't be ranked. But Alex and I have talked about him many, many times, and there was no way to rank managers. And even though I covered Sparky Anderson for his entire career in Detroit, and I really liked Sparky, I thought the world of him. He was no more colorful than Jim Leland, and Jim Leland is just one of our favorites. And I speak for myself. He's such an honest individual, such an original. And I know Alex says the same thing.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, all of us that had played for Jim, would run through a wall for that man. He was just like a second father to me. And I know Tom, like he knows his sense of humor pretty well. Very good singer. I tell people all the time, like especially if any Tigers fans traveled with us to Kansas City and we're at the team hotel at the Intercontinental. There was a piano in the lobby, and every once in a while, if we ended up winning that night's game, Jim would be down there by the piano, by the lobby bar, singing whatever song the piano player was playing, and putting on a concert for everybody. But
were you in the? I think it was either Cleveland or Minnesota, the day that you clinched something, and Jim came in and did that moonwalk.
Yeah, he moonwalked out of the clubhouse after we had clinched in Minnesota in 2013. And terrific dancer, terrific singer, great sense of humor, but also knew when to get on you when he needed to. And I think that was one of his greatest strengths, is knowing how to motivate players, knowing when to pat you on the back, when he needed to kind of get into you a little bit to fire you up. And he just had that knack of making you feel like you were his best friend, but you also knew where the line was in the sand. And he had a great rapport with all of his players. I had told Tom the story of like when I first got called up, my first game in the big leagues. I had known Jim for a long time at this point, because he had also worked for my father with the Marlins, and they won a World Series in '97. And my first at bat, though, I get called up mainly to provide a little bit of an offensive spark for the team. I was having a good season offensively in the minor leagues. And my first at bat, I strike out looking. And I'm walking back to the dugout, and Jim's at the top step, and he's got his hand over his mouth so the camera doesn't, read his lips or anything like that. And he goes, "Damn it, Alex, I brought you up here to swing the bat. What are you taking a called third strike for? Swing the damn bat." And I wasn't going to say anything to Skip or anything like that. I just I took that, and I thought to myself, my next at bat, I'm swinging at everything. And first pitch, I swung at it hit an RBI double down the first base line. And but he just had an incredible way about him to be able to get the most out of you as a player. I think he had a certain presence that when he walked into a room, it was everyone turned their head to Jim. And I was going to tell this story. I don't think you know this story yet, but it was my second year in the big leagues, and most people know my family history, right? When it comes to the game, my dad was the general manager and assistant general manager here for a long time. He also was an assistant general manager for the Marlins prior, and then my grandfather as well was a vice president with the Dodgers for over 50 years. And
I was going to mention this at the end. Alex is a 3-generational baseball presence here. And you just don't, there are others. There are not many of 3 generations of the same family in baseball. You have Aaron Boone and Bob Boone and Ray Boone being a former Tiger. I didn't know them. But the Avila family has been a real baseball presence.
I appreciate that. But on this, with my grandfather had working for the Dodgers, one of his best friends was Tommy Lasorda. And, Tommy was a really good family friend. I was named after Tommy. My middle name is Thomas. And so I finally get to the big leagues, and we're out in L.A. We're going to play the Dodgers in interleague series. And Tommy, during my childhood, would come to my little league games on occasion when he had time. Would practice with me when I was a kid. I was very lucky to have that, but I think he always saw me as like, one of his kids. But he knew how much and how close myself and Jim were. And so we're in LA, and first game of that series, Lasorda comes walking in, and anybody that knows anything about Lasorda, very boisterous. He wants to make sure that when he's entering a room, everyone knows he's entering the room. And
when he used to come into the game down in spring training, down in Vero Beach, they used to play "Hail to the Chief."
Yeah. So he comes barging into the visiting clubhouse, yelling, "Where's my godson? Where's my godson?" Looking for me, knowing he sees me, but he wants to make sure that everyone knows that he's looking for me. Jim Leland comes running out of the manager's office. "God damn it, shut that guy up. Who let him in there?" He starts cursing at Tommy Lasorda to get him the hell out of there, that, not to talk to me, that he's a Tiger now. He has nothing to do with the Dodgers. So the two of them in the middle of the clubhouse start cursing at each other about who had more influence over me. And now, all of it was in jest, and they were having a good time with it. And I think, both of them were very proud and happy to the fact that I was playing in the big leagues. So it was a fun moment, and I was, quite embarrassed, but at the same time, I'm like, here's Jim Leland and Tommy Lasorda, yelling at each other over me. So I
wish
felt
I'd
pretty good
been there
about
to
it.
see that. I really do. My favorite Leland story was from 3 years ago when he was inducted into the Hall of Fame. Alex and I were both on hand because we frankly, we considered ourselves friends of his. And and I tell Jim, "Hey, I'm going to steal this line from you," and I have many times, and I'm going to steal it again right now. When the day that he got the call from the Hall of Fame to tell him that he was elected into the Hall of Fame, it was a great day for the Leland family. Both their kids were home. It was just a wonderful, wonderful day. And at the end of the day, when they had gone to bed and the lights were out, he turned to his wife and said, "Katie, in your wildest dreams, did you ever think I'd be elected into the Hall of Fame?" And Katie turned to him and said, "Jim, I hate to tell you, but you're not in my wildest dreams." And I've told him, "Jim, that's the best line I've ever heard given in a Hall of Fame speech. I'm going to steal it, and I always do." So anyway, at this point, we go to, that's our presentation. We go to questions. If any of you have any questions, please don't hesitate to ask. You got to raise your hand, though. Okay.
Hello. Hi, Alex. This is a question for you. I was wondering, when you are preparing for a game for each batter that's coming up, how you decide on kind of what to throw for each one, and kind of just what your process is like for that.
Great question. So a lot of times what I would do before the game with the starting pitcher is, at some point before the game, we'd get together once the lineup of the other team would come out, and we'd go hitter by hitter and discuss their strengths and weaknesses, and basically compare them to my pitcher's strengths and weaknesses for whoever was throwing that day. And basically we just kind of line it up as far as like what they've been doing really well, what they haven't been doing well, and compared to the pitcher's arsenal. So if so-and-so was maybe 3 for 23 on sliders with 2 strikes, he's probably going to see a slider with 2 strikes, or at least we're going to try to set it up in order to throw a slider in those situations. At times during the game, though, we would adjust that, kind of inning by inning, and each time we would have to face the hitter. And a lot of that was based off of instinct and just using your eyes. So a lot of times we'd use the analytics, we use the numbers to create a game plan as far as what hitters, what they're not doing very well or what their weaknesses are, try to exploit those weaknesses, and then as the game went on, look for tendencies in the hitter and seeing if, like, maybe they're making an adjustment. Yes, so-and-so might be struggling with a slider, but on that particular at bat, there might be a tell that is telling me he might be sitting on that pitch. And even a major league hitter, if he's struggling with the pitch, if he's looking for something in particular, and you don't locate quite as well, they can do some damage. So not only that, but then also as the game goes on, I'm watching my pitcher, seeing his reactions, how he's fatiguing. Sometimes that'll play an effect on his execution. So also might play an effect on what pitches I'm calling. Sometimes, later in my career when I had a lot more experience and trusting my instincts, sometimes I would also even try to anticipate when the pitcher might make a mistake. So a lot of those things would all factor in as the game was progressing.
Once in a while, though, you had a pitcher on the Tigers who didn't want to participate in any hitters' meetings. Mickey Lolich never wanted to. He would say about his teammates would say, "Come on into the scouting session," and he would say, "I throw what I throw, and I'm not going to change." And but you had some pitchers.
Most guys, I'd say, would like to go over a game plan prior to the game. To have an idea. Most guys still go with the catcher because it's one less thing they have to think about while they're up there. But at the same time, I always encouraged my pitchers, like, hey, I don't mind if you shake me because I need your input. Like, you shaking me gives me information that I don't have. I don't know how you're feeling at the moment. I can't tell. I can maybe see and take a guess. But if I call a curveball and you're just not feeling it, I don't want you to throw that pitch, without the conviction needed to execute it.
Haven't you said, though, that somebody as good as Doug Fister didn't want to talk about the hitters?
Doug Fister didn't. After my Tigers days when I played with the White Sox, I caught Chris Sale. Same thing. Chris Sale never talked about the hitters.
Really?
Yeah, he would just kind of go with whatever we called. There's some guys too that have great stuff and great command that they can do that as long as the catcher does their homework. There's also moments in the game too that that are very much the decision is made without any sort of numbers and analytics or information. It's almost like hey, you know what? This is my best stuff against your best stuff. I might know that hitter's really good with hitting fastballs, but I got Justin Verlander on the mound and it's a 3-2 count in the 8th inning with guys on base and the fans are into it. I'm like, give him the heater. Let's see if we can blow him away here. And there were times where it's like kind of just there's a little machoism there too to just try to beat you. But it's there's a lot that goes into each pitch that's called. And the reason why it happens quickly enough though is there's a lot of the catchers study it relentlessly. It's every single day and. That's why a lot of people say we're kind of like the quarterbacks of a baseball team.
Alex, of all the pitchers you caught, can you tell us who loved his fastball the most? I mean, when all was said and done, he would rely on the fastball.
Well, that's easily Justin.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, he was very proud of his fastball. Was always concerned about his fastball and his velocity during spring training. That was always a topic of conversation. He would always come in spring training, his velocity would kind of be like middle of spring training, not exactly where he would want it to be. And I'd always like, Justin, we do this every spring training. Like you're concerned that, you're not going to be throwing 100 this year. And by the end of spring training, you're throwing 100. So like, it'll come.
Any others?
I have a question, sort of an offbeat question. Since I've been a Tiger fan, I've noticed that many of the catchers wear the number 13, and they continue to wear the number 13 as Dingler does, and you did. And so I was wondering, is that the assigned number for catchers?
It's kind of an unspoken rule now. Obviously, Lance, Lance wore number 13, and that's actually a pretty good story, at least on my end, where when I got called up that year in spring training, I was number 87. Shows you how far down the totem pole I was there. And so when I got called up later that year, usually like when a player gets called up or traded, the clubhouse manager asks that player, hey, what number do you want? But I never got that call. They never asked me. I walk into the clubhouse. I didn't think anything of it. I was just happy I was getting a call to the big leagues. And my jersey's hanging in the locker, and it's got the number 13 on it. And I'm just kind of taking it all in, looking at the jersey, my locker, and Jim Schmankel, the longtime clubhouse manager, walks up behind me and just kind of whispers in my ear, whose numbers that is. And I was well aware that Lance Parrish wore number 13, and so I was like, yes, I do. And that was like, he left it at that. He just wanted to make sure that I knew. And a couple of years later, me and Lance had started to develop a relationship, and we were doing during a Tigers Fest one year like a Q&A session, and somebody had asked him a very similar question, that he wore 13, I was wearing 13, and he went on kind of gloating and very proud of the fact that I was wearing it, that I was doing it proud. And it made me feel amazing, because Lance's approval and respect was everything to me. And then I think since, it's kind of been unspoken that it's kind of become a catcher's number. Dylan Dingler's well aware that Lance wore it, I wore it, going down the line, and Dylan's going to play in the All-Star game tomorrow. He's the first Tigers catcher to be an All-Star since I was in 2011. So there's a lot of nice connections there with the number 13, and I think as time goes on, like it'll continue to be a catcher's number. Mm-hmm.
Hi, this one is about Jim Leland. I got to meet him a few years back, well, more than a few years back, and the discussion came up, and the name was mentioned. You'll like this, Alex. Benny DeStefano. Yeah. And when I was younger, I worked out with Benny quite a bit, and taught me a lot about catching, a lot more than I thought I didn't know about it. Appreciate that. And I mentioned that, and he goes, now I know why you didn't make it back up to the bigs. And I said, wait a minute. I wasn't the one who started a left-handed catcher.
Yeah.
And I'll just add to that, and you probably already know this. I'm going to let you know. I'll hit it up for you. But do you know who the last left-handed catcher to play in the Major League was?
Yes, it was Benny DeStefano.
It was Benny DeStefano.
Yes. Wow.
So I said to Jim Leland, and he just loved it. He says, where are you from? I said, New York. He says, go figure. The other question, I have one more question if I can. I'm going to show my age. Darrell Evans played, I think, 5 years with Detroit.
Yeah.
And he was on the World Series team. Was he? I haven't read your book, so is he anywhere on the list? I just remember him growing up and playing for Atlanta and just crushing my Mets. So
Darrell Evans is on the list. He's not in the top 30, but I believe he's around number 50. And so out of 258, I remember I was on the phone with Darrell to do his profile, and the problem with being on the phone with Darrell is you can't get off the phone with Darrell. And I was explaining to him about the book, and I said, "Hey, and you're number 50," and he went, "Oh," and because every player wants to be or thinks that they deserve a higher rank than they got, but to me, Darrell Evans had a good Tiger career. It wasn't the longest Tiger career, but he ended up being where he should be. So
to give everyone a little context to your Benny DeStefano story. So Benny DeStefano was actually one of my coaches in Grand Rapids for the Whitecaps after I got drafted by the Tigers, and how I came to know that story. So Benny DeStefano, while playing in the big leagues for the Pittsburgh Pirates when Jim Leland was the manager, in a pinch, they needed a catcher, and they didn't have an emergency catcher at the time, and Benny DeStefano ended up becoming that emergency catcher for Jim Leland with the Pirates. So he was the last left-handed throwing catcher to ever play the position in the big leagues.
I've got a question for you, though. Before catching, you were a third baseman.
Correct.
Lance Parrish was drafted as a third baseman.
Mm-hmm.
Does Dylan Dingler have any third base in his history?
No, he was maybe as a young kid, but through college he was a catcher through and through. He was always a catcher.
All right. Is there any special connection between the two
Well, I think third base. I mean, one, to play third base, you have to have a good arm and you have to have soft hands. So I think those two, are the first two things you kind of look at, for a catcher. Third base too. You don't need as much range as you would if you're playing in the middle of the infield. So, you're going to be a little bit stockier usually. When Johnny Bench, towards the end of his career, he played third base a little bit. Towards the end of his career when he wasn't catching as much, and it just the footwork translates pretty well, and then the two things you really need the most, a good arm and soft hands, and so I think that's why catchers and third basemen, you tend to see some correlation there.
Did you leave third base with a degree of sadness?
No, not really. I left third base and started catching out of necessity when I was at school at Alabama, and I was playing third base, and we lost two of our catchers towards the end of my sophomore year.
And so in high school you played third?
In high school I played third as well, yes. And so the summer after my sophomore year at Alabama, I'm playing in the Cape Cod League, and our head coach calls me up, said, what do you think about moving to catcher? And I said, it sounds like a great idea, because we have a freshman third baseman coming in that can possibly, start for us in the SEC as a freshman. I want to give him that opportunity. But we don't have a catcher at the moment. I think he'd be good at it. What do you think about giving it a try? I'm like, yeah, sounds great. I'll try it. But at the same time, I'm also thinking in the back of my head, I've never caught before. I have to go into the fall, learn how to catch to be the starting catcher for an SEC baseball team. I'm like, I don't know how this is going to work out. And but it ended up working out. I caught like half the games and DH'd the other half the games, and then got drafted as a catcher and just continued to progress, in my development. And to this, I mean, it's the best decision I ever made.
So to that degree, yours and Lance's careers were parallel. You were both had experience at third and behind the plate, but the Tigers tried to turn Lance into a switch hitter. Did anybody ever try to turn you into a switch hitter?
So I was a switch hitter going into Alabama.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I was a switch hitter my freshman year at Alabama, and then left-handed. I started to develop a lot more power left-handed.
Okay.
And so our head coach, again, actually, I think a smart decision on his part, asked me just to hit left-handed. I was an okay hitter right-handed, but I had much more power left-handed. And he goes, I'd rather, we'll take a few hits on your batting average, but, you'll run into a few more home runs. And I always credit him for doing that, though. And one of the reasons why I got to the big leagues so quickly was because I only had to worry about one swing as opposed to two swings. And, to this day, I always, think that was a big reason why I got to the big leagues.
Do you do anything else left-handed?
I don't do, well, I swing a golf club left-handed, swing a bat left-handed, but I do everything else right-handed.
Okay.
Yeah.
Can you play golf right-handed?
I can play golf right-handed.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Sounds like you're a Brandon Inge.
Yeah, right. Not as good as Brandon,
All
though.
right, another question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask. It was a pretty important era, but I didn't hear you say anything about the bird.
I didn't hear that.
Fidrich, Mark the Bird.
Oh, yeah, I'm glad you brought him up, because we usually talk about Fidrich. Fidrich, of course, had his one great season, 1976, and then he got hurt. And this list is about as much about longevity as it is about talent and productivity. And Mark just didn't have the number of seasons to rank. He's on the list. He's not high on the list, but you'll find his name. He didn't finish high enough to have a profile written about him, but there's a list in the back of the book of all 258 hitters and all 142 pitchers, and Mark Fidrich is on the list. Any others?
Okay, we got time for one more.
One more.
Last question.
Well, we got two more here, so maybe two more. Pete?
We got time for one more, but if you make it super fast.
All right.
Hi, this is a question for Alex, I guess. What are your thoughts on the ABS challenge system in today's game, and are there any instances, and when you were playing, were you just thinking back of, I wish I could just tap my helmet right now?
Many times, many times as a catcher and a hitter. I like it actually. I think it's brought an element of strategy to the game for players and teams that I enjoy. It's really showcased how good umpires are, because a lot of these pitches that are getting challenged are an eighth of an inch off the plate, coming in at 100 miles an hour. Moving 3 or 4 feet in either direction. It's showcasing players that are really good at knowing the strike zone, and also, providing some comedy and what players really don't know the strike zone. But I think it's also been enjoyable for fans, especially when you're at the ball game. Because when it happens, it's something else that keeps your attention, as opposed to looking at your phone or doing something else. To where when a challenge happens, they put it up on the board, and the reaction that I've seen and heard has been great. And it's extremely important too, because we've seen throughout the season, single challenges can really flip an inning. It makes a big difference if you're a player that really knows and understands the strike zone, but then also when to use them. So I like that element of strategy, just something else that a player has to be good at, over the course of a game. So I would have enjoyed it.
Alex, you were such an even-tempered player. Did you ever have a either catching or at the plate or hitting, have a pitch call infuriate you?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. But I think I had built up my reputation with the umpires was phenomenal, and I think a lot of that had to do with I was very honest with them, because when a lot of times over the course of the game, whether I was catching or hitting, the umpire will ask players, what do you think about that pitch? Like if there was a question on that pitch, whether it was the catcher or the hitter. And, a lot of times when I was catching, umpire makes a call, the batter doesn't like it. Once that at-bat's done, as the next one's coming up, he might ask me, hey, what do you think, was that there? Was that low, high? And I'd be honest, completely honest with them, knowing that after the game, they're going to know. So they're going to know whether you're being honest with them or not. So I think that built my credibility with a lot of the umpires. So I had a lot of leeway to where when I, questioned a call, most of them understood, like, okay, I might have missed that one. At the same time, too, there was a constant, back and forth of managing the umpire, but then also managing my pitcher as well, especially behind the plate. With Justin, I remember one time in particular, he wasn't getting pitches just off the plate. I can't remember the umpire's name at the moment, but he was hitting the target, but it was just off, and the umpire kept asking me, like, where do you have that? Where do you have that? Because he thought he was right on. Justin kept yelling at him from the mound after every pitch that's a strike, and so he kept asking me, and I'm telling him, no, it's a ball. Like, it's just off the plate. It's off the plate. I'm being honest with him, thinking that we might need that call later on in the game, and we'll get it. But every time we'd go into the dugout after the inning, Justin comes right to me. He goes, are you getting on him? Because that pitch is right there. That's a strike. That's a strike. And I tell Justin, it's like, you're right. That's a strike. I'm getting on him. I'm telling him that's a strike. He did, But in reality, I'm telling the umpire, no, he's right. He's got a ball. So sometimes I'm playing, both sides here, knowing that, hey, Justin's doing fine without it now, but when we really need it, we might need it later in the game. And, that's how I kind of had to, build the credibility and relationships with the umpires.
Can we take one more, Peter? Is that it?
That's it. Maybe they can ask you when you're getting a book signed. We have to wrap up, and the library starts closing in less than 15 minutes. So we unfortunately sold out of our books, but Booksuite was nice enough to leave some bookmarks. So if you did want something signed and you didn't have something and weren't able to get a book, but please join me in thanking Alex Avila and Tom Gage for this wonderful conversation.
Thank you for coming out.
Would you guys like to